In the last section, we talked about hash functions. There are 3 different authentication mechanisms for Windows. 2 of them, Landman authentication and NTLM, require the use of hash functions. Kerberos is a little bit different. We'll talk about that last authentication mechanism in a second. For us, when we're talking about getting into a local workstation, we're using the local administrator account. That local administrator account is stored in either Landman or NTLM. NTLM version 1 is backward compatible. NTLM version 2 is not, so therefore what that means is it's going to take us longer. If we're doing password cracking against NTLM, it's going to take us a little bit longer. But since Landman and NTLM credentials are stored as a hash on the local workstation, all we need to do is reach into the SAM and get where we're going. That's not true with Kerberos. Let's look at each one of these. First, Landman relies on the hash. The Landman hash is never sent across the network, but here's the problem. The way the Landman hash works, the way the protocol works for digesting the password itself into the hash, is it separates the password into 7-character chunks. And if we've got 2 7-character chunks, we can attack either one of them separately. Suppose you have an 8-character password. I'm not going to, in Landman, attack the first 7 characters. I'm going to attack the last 7 characters, and only one of them is a value there. So when we do our brute forcing, what do we brute force? A through Z, and I'm going to get that one letter, that one piece of punctuation. I only have to run through a couple of things, and I'll get that piece of the password. Once I know that, I use that to go ahead and attack the previous 7 characters. Usually you can get a hint out of that last character to get your first 7 characters. But since it's 7-character hashes, the rainbow tables for this are really small comparatively to other pieces. What we can also do in Landman is we can do a replay attack against this. If we see the credentials going across the network, we can capture those credentials and then use them against this particular box. And that means that we're in a situation where they're authenticating to a database outside of their local computer. That's probably not going to happen in a corporate environment, but it may be that somebody decides to set up a little network in their home, a little authentication database in their home, and they're passing credentials across the wire there. That may be a way for us to gain access at a certain particular time to get our investigators to listen up and pay attention from a forensic standpoint, to not just barge down the door and take the computer, but wait for them to key that in or put in key loggers or put in listening devices to actually pick up that password. You're looking for any edge that you can get against the adversary so that you can get in and then start doing your job. Remember, in this whole thing, passwords are in your way of doing your forensics examination, so you want to get around them. You may ask for cooperation from the investigating officer or somebody who's actually doing the search and seizure. Say, hey, wait a minute, this is complex. We've got hundreds of computers here. Let's figure out how we can work with it. We want to seize all this stuff, but we want to be able to seize it in a way that we can dig down into it quickly and actually do the assessment. So replay attacks work against Landman. Let's look at NTLM authentication. This is more secure than Landman. It's got a 16-byte hash value, which, again, that hash value is attackable through a rainbow table. It's relatively small. It's less susceptible to brute force than Landman, but by today's standards, NTLM is attackable in brute force with the computing power that we have. Its main weakness is backward compatibility. Now, most of the time, if you've got a true network administrator, what they'll say is in their NTLM programming for the policy of their authentication database in the central location, they'll say no backward compatibility. We won't dumb down to the previous version, because the reason why we had this dumbing down effect was we'd have a centralized authentication database of the new version of the server, and then we'd have workstations out in the field that were the old version of the workstation. And we said, well, we don't want to upgrade these machines they're still using Landman, we'll allow that to occur, and then when we migrate each one of those machines over to NTLM, well, then they'll use the new protocol to send their authentication, and then we'll eventually get rid of this machine right here. Well, this machine right here with Landman on it is going to present its credentials in Landman terms to that new NTLM database, and the NTLM database will say, oh, I'm backward compatible, I'll dumb down for you. But if we've got all updated infrastructure, what normally happens is good security administrators will go in and will say, no backward compatibility, we're going to turn that off, and that's a policy setting, so therefore they won't accept those credentials as they're passed. So backward compatibility is a weakness in it, but today's standards, we don't use a lot of NTLM, we don't use a lot of Landman. What do we use? Well, we use Kerberos. Kerberos is symmetric authentication. It is symmetric keys that are stored in the centralized repository and on the workstation. It relies on the system, the security of the system, the access, the tickets. It relies on that centralized database. If we're going into a corporation, we realize that they're authenticating against that Kerberos database using Active Directory. So the channel that goes back and forth between client and server is encrypted with Kerberos, and they're using Kerberos passwords. But more importantly, if they're trying to gain access to a resource, let's say I'm sitting here on my workstation, I'm authenticating there, and I want to get to this database. Well, now in this process, I'm passing credentials back and forth to that particular database. I don't do that directly. What I do is I do it through the Kerberos authentication mechanism, and then we generate this symmetric encryption between us using symmetric authentication. Tickets is what it's called. So how would we as forensics investigator encounter Kerberos? We would encounter it in a corporate environment, not on single workstations. And also remember, if you've got a single workstation, we're attacking that local security accounts manager database, that SAM database, that we want that hash that's stored locally here. Even if this computer is a part of a domain, it was at one point in time authenticated locally with a system account that was used here, and that may be stored in the backup versions of the registry. That's passwords for us. Remember, the whole goal here is to put on those evil glasses, think like the adversary, and figure out a great way for us to get to the business of forensics investigation.